Good evening, and welcome to Democratic Television, a public affairs show where we discuss events and issues that impact our democratic values. My name is Lisa Plawchan, and I will be your host this evening. Tonight, we will present an analysis on the 2018 midterm elections, focusing specifically on Knox County and Tennessee. We will dig into the data and share where there were gains, areas to improve, and what we can learn moving into the 2020 races. It's an honor to be joined by two political gurus here in Knox County, Chris Barber, who is campaign manager for Greg Mackay,
Yes.
State House, District 18.
Yes, thank you for having me, Lisa.
And Will Callaway, campaign manager for Renee Hoyos
Thank
for
you.
Congress,
Thank you.
2nd Congressional District. Thank you both for being here tonight, and thank you for your tireless dedication to supporting Democrats and Knox County and Tennessee. I think there's no question that you ran two of the strongest campaigns this election cycle, and we are so appreciative of everything you've done and having you here.
Glad to do it.
So let's begin by looking at the big picture. We had 116 Democratic candidates run in state and federal races, which is unprecedented. We flipped 2 seats in the state house, one being Gloria Johnson in House District 13. And now we're sending 2 delegates from Knox County to the state legislature to represent us in Nashville. What are some of the biggest things that you took away from the midterm results here in Tennessee? Chris, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, clearly we're very proud of Gloria Johnson. I think her presence in the legislature is long overdue, and she will certainly do us justice there. For me personally, I think I was very impressed with the volunteer momentum. I saw so many new faces this cycle, and it was very humbling. From my day-to-day experience in a campaign, sometimes the grind is a bit burdensome, but these are the people that keep me, and I think the candidates too, inspired to go around. So going forward into next cycle, I look forward to a fresh slate of volunteers, more donors, and a lot of new energy as well. So that's what I'm very impressed with.
Great. Well, how about you? What were your kind of takeaways?
I think I was a little bit not surprised, but pleased to see the outside parties that were involved. In previous races, the candidate has always been kind of the leading force, and there's a set of volunteers that works around them. We had groups like the Women's March. We had indivisible groups, both in Knoxville and outside of Knoxville, that were involved. And they came in and did a lot of the organizing, and that was key to outreach, some areas where maybe a candidate couldn't get to or a campaign manager couldn't get to, and they were able to do that. And they maintained that momentum from the moment they either endorsed or got engaged right up to November 6th. And that's the one big difference that I saw. And I think your turnout, especially in the precincts where you saw 45% more turnout, that is in large part due, I think, to some of the third parties that came in and really pushed voter registration, get out the vote efforts, and got behind individual candidates as well.
So, and I think it's worth mentioning that those groups that you specified are new. I mean, they just came about like within the last 2 years since the last presidential election. So
Indivisible specifically.
yes.
The impetus behind that, I think, was the idea of civic engagement, which is critically important, and that when you wake up after an election and you are not just surprised, but you're shocked at the results, there is a natural inclination to step up and say, okay, I want to do something. But how do you implement that? How do you sit down and say, A, what can I do? B, how do I do it? And C, how do I produce an outcome that I want? And so for those groups, at least Indivisible specifically, Moms Demand Action was another group that's really been active. And for the Women's March, working closely with them, I know it's an annual event, but they carry that out throughout the election cycle as well.
Okay. And you had mentioned volunteerism. I think that is huge because that helped with voter contact, which is very important. Do you want to talk more about voter contact and how those efforts really helped influence your campaign in particular?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as Democratic organizers, we're accustomed to the fact that Democratic campaigns are people-powered, Republican campaigns are money-powered. We rely off this person-to-person contact in order to convey our message. I saw Phil Bredesen speak at the Love Kitchen a few weeks ago, and he summed it up well, is that we've kind of come full circle to this point where voters are relying more and more off the firsthand accounts of their friends and family to help inform their decisions about an election. So, direct voter contact takes so many forms, and as technology progresses and develops, there's only new ways to see that through. Of course, every campaign focuses on phone banking and canvassing, and of course, social media has an ever more prominent role in campaigns. I'm happy that our data has gotten better for phone banking. Canvassing is something that I think will forever be a crucial tool for every campaign. And for all the years I've done this, I have knocked tens of thousands of doors myself, and sometimes I have the sensation that, oh my gosh, these people must be so sick of having folks knock at their door. But every cycle, there's that one voter who is just completely blown away that a candidate or a volunteer bothers to come and personally ask for their vote. So that is something that we can never discount, and we must continue to hold close to our heart.
And I think too that you brought that up. So many people whose doors that we knocked on, they either hadn't heard of the candidate, or there was some particular issue that they really wanted to discuss, and so they appreciated having that personal connection. And I know both of your candidates were out at various groups and meetings and always interacting with their constituents and trying to get a feel for what issues are important to them.
I think in the minds of a lot of voters, and it's become my personal belief, that the work ethic of a candidate during the campaign will be reflective of how they behave in office. And I think for both of our candidates, with Renee and Greg, they worked so hard for it. And I think that a lot of voters look at that and they realize that they would have been excellent representatives of their districts.
Right.
There is an element of what the candidate wants to do and how the candidate wants to engage. And I'm not going to cast any aspersions on any individual candidates, but I know with Renee, since it was her first campaign, there was an energy there that I think people related to, and they understood, and there was feedback from that. And for anyone who wants to run for office, the first question is why? Why are you running for office? But the second question is, what does this mean? I've seen a lot of candidates who are happy to run for office, but then they don't necessarily understand what they're doing. Politics is a means to an end. It is not the end. The end is representing people. The aspect that I think I saw from a lot of candidates, from Greg, from Gloria, from Renee, was that they were in the process in order to share their opinions, get feedback, and try to figure out what issues were important. And that was just part of the process for them. It wasn't that there was something formulaic about it. That is part of the civic engagement that I talked about earlier. And a lot of the Democratic candidates did that, and they understood more and more as the campaign went on how important that was. And we've seen that nationwide, the feedback from candidates who got out, really engaged directly with people. That separation is something that some of the older, more I won't say entrenched, but some of the politicians that have been around a long time may start to lose that because they just get accustomed to election cycle after election cycle.
Yeah. I think you mentioned something that I want to just grab onto is how many of these candidates were first-time candidates and how well that they did. Do you want to speak to that?
Sure. So this cycle, unlike any I've ever been involved in, I am so impressed with the slate of candidates that we had.
Yes.
I mean, specifically with Jamie Bollinger and so many that, despite them being amateurs to the campaign trail, they brought a legitimacy that East Tennessee has never seen from a Democratic candidate before. And I think it is paramount that in going forward, the Knox County Democratic Party, the Tennessee Democratic Party, that we continue to recruit candidates who take this very seriously, and that will be reflected in the voters' opinions as well. So I'm very hopeful.
And when do you think that recruitment, I think you hit something that I've been trying to process too in doing this analysis, is when does that recruitment for candidates begin for the 2020 cycle? I mean, I think recruitment is important because after you recruit someone, you also have to train them.
Sure.
So when would you say that?
Well, if you're looking at the 2020 cycle for a state race or for a federal race, I think you need to start thinking about it early next year. As how does the process happen? What do I need to do? Renee was a first-time candidate. There was quite a bit to do, and that takes some time to get organized. Mm-hmm. You don't need to come out in January of 2019 and say, I'm running and here's my campaign structure and all of that. I think some candidates get a sense of urgency because the campaign cycles seem to be continuous right now. We have a mayoral race in Knoxville that's getting started right now, so there's going to be some attention focused to that. And 2020 is going to gear up pretty quickly. At the state level and at the federal level, the dynamic in 2020 is going to be dictated by the presidential race and what happens. And that is both a good and a bad thing. I think there are going to be some problems coming out of Washington that all of us have to look at. That doesn't necessarily impact the state races, but it's going to trickle down. So I think if you're going into 2020 and you want to run, it would be great if you could run on issues and you had a platform that everyone could really look at and it would appeal. I believe that's going to be a little bit overwhelmed by some declarations from a certain individual at the top currently, and as well as, again, these different outside groups. How do they engage? So I've run for office. I encourage everyone to run for office at some point, but realize the sacrifice that it's going to take. Fundraising is paramount in these election cycles. And as I said to Renee when she called me more than a year and a half ago, be ready for Wednesday morning.
Yes.
Because if you win, you're extremely happy. If you lose, you have to be prepared for what I've described as the equivalent of a small business startup that you invested in this case, $300,000 worth of capital in, that you spent every day of your life working on. And on Wednesday morning, that small business is gone. You have no insurance, you have no capital, you have nothing. It's just gone.
It's a great analogy.
So be aware of that as a candidate.
Yeah.
Going forward.
And I think that's something that Chris and I were talking about before we started, was the setting expectations ahead of time. So I think that's something that it looks like you were wanting to add something to what Will was saying.
Yeah, absolutely. It is true that the Wednesday morning, regardless of the outcome, you lose most of what you worked for. But it's important that we retain the campaign infrastructure like volunteers and data. And I've told Greg, and I would expect any other candidate to know this. Anybody who's considering a run for 2020, is that you develop a reputation when you run for office, and to simply fade from the scene if you lose an election, I think is an improper thing to do. It's crucial that candidates stay involved regardless of the outcome of an election, and help propel other Democratic candidates going forward.
I want to talk specifically about your races and some of the things that maybe really stood out to you Wednesday morning, or since we've had some time to process the results.
Sure. Well, with Greg specifically, what I was always attracted to him in as a candidate was that I felt he had bipartisan appeal in a time in politics when people were hungering for that. And what I was shocked by was the element to which people truly didn't actually deviate from the party ticket line. When I look at the numbers and I see here's Phil Bredesen outperformed Renee and Greg in a number of situations, but by and large, people obeyed the Renee, Jamie, Greg party line. So what that leads me to believe is that like Will alluded to in 2020, that the tone of the campaign will be set by what's happening above all of us on the ballot. Is that we have to be prepared to confront what's going on nationally at a local scale, because frankly most voters conceive of politics as a national enterprise now. They don't necessarily see it as something very localized like we do. So the better our candidates can be to address that, the better they will fare in elections.
Well, in Renee's case, it's 7 counties. It's approximately 720,000 people in a congressional district. It is a fairly compact district. We're not a badly gerrymandered district, so that made it a little bit easier to get around. She did a couple of things early on. She committed to the campaign. She committed to events. She set up events and did outreach to hundreds and hundreds of people every week. It's a critical aspect of it. Knoxville certainly has changed. I think you've got some graphics that demonstrate that. We knew that would happen. I think if she were running for the congressional representative for Knox City, she would have won.
Yes.
But that it is not a congressional district is not a city limit. I grew up in East Tennessee. It's very conservative, and it remains very conservative. I've been involved in campaigns in Chattanooga. Chattanooga has shifted. I've now been involved in a couple of campaigns in this area. Knoxville has shifted. The rural areas have not changed a great deal. There is still a sense of party line vote. I got that feedback often when I was in Granger or Claiborne and talked with people. And I got less of the question here, what party is she in? But in the counties, I very frequently got, is she a Republican or is she a Democrat?
And would they continue to talk to you after you said that she was a Democrat?
I got such a myriad of responses. There was, she's a Democrat. Oh, I am too, but don't tell anybody.
Yeah.
I'm a Republican. I'm curious as to what she thinks. I'm a Republican. What in the hell are you doing here? Yeah. There were not extremes though. There was not a lot of backlash, and people by and large were engaging. I grew up in a rural county and felt like walking in and talking to somebody for me, and it should be for any candidate. If you make assumptions on the front end, you've made a mistake. So that's why you engage in with these folks and find out what are their interests, and if they want to get into the Republican Democratic thing, which many people do when it comes to an election, that's fine. I find it's much more important to talk about issues, but party, as Chris talked earlier about, in terms of what people did on November 6th, we still had a lot of folks that just went in and stuck with the traditional sense of this is how I voted and this is how I'm going to vote going forward.
And I think we saw that even in the Bredesen race too, the urban-rural disconnect. And so one thing I wanted to ask you specifically was how did those conversations in the rural areas differ from your urban areas? And what how is there a way that we can get people to not focus on the D and the R in the rural areas?
Well, in our case, healthcare was a consistent message. People are worried about their healthcare. They think they pay too much, or maybe they're not able to get the type of healthcare they need. That is a consistent message no matter where you live. And I think the Democratic Party needs to make sure they stay focused on that. When you get out into a rural area, you will hear about broadband. You will talk about agricultural programs that you might not talk about when you're sitting in the DTV studios or anywhere in Knoxville for that matter. But there is, and this is my impression, I would not say that this is a truism. I think there's a fundamental belief in a lot of the rural areas that they want their lives to be better, but they don't want their lives to change. A lot of people choose to live in rural communities because they like that. They enjoy the lifestyle. They don't want to be in an urban area. They do want higher pay. They do want better health care, and they do want better education. But they also want to let their children grow up and have the same lifestyle that they have. That is not an easy needle to thread. But if you're running for office, you really need to understand that, I think.
I want to just take a few minutes to talk about some of the wins. You've mentioned volunteerism, we've mentioned voter contact, we've mentioned the emergence of these new groups. I also read recently that Greg flipped 4 precincts in his district. Gloria did as well. So I feel that needle is moving.
Yes.
And people need to hear that message more. How would you recommend us spreading that message a little bit more to the new volunteers that have never worked on a campaign before and they're not used to a loss? I mean, they just expected to come into the election night party and see, blue, 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 blue wins. So, how do we share these wins, these other wins? And there's so many more. I mean, please add to the list because there are quite a few.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the areas that Greg did really well in, specifically West Hills, which would be precincts 46 and 47, respectively. These are old suburban areas in Knoxville that have experienced an influx of young professional families. I think it's crucial for the local party to build relationships with this class of people and continue to foster their engagement locally. To that end as well, another precinct Greg specifically did well in was 68E, which, in my view, has mostly apartments in it. And so I know it's a transitory type of folks, and we've had difficulty connecting with people who don't stay in one residence for very long when we're canvassing and whatnot. So trying to talk more to those people would be good, I think.
I've watched Tennessee change since I began. I worked for Jim Sasser, my very first job in the late 1980s. And I've watched Tennessee change. Some areas have become much more insular. They're concerned only about what is going on in their community, their family, their church, and those things. And that is how they vote. That's where they move. We have a lot of people moving into the Knoxville area. Projected growth is 2-3% going forward in the next decade. I think what you're seeing is that you have folks with a lot of outside experiences coming in. I think the education level for a lot of folks who are moving into these more qualitative jobs is changing. So there are, I'm afraid, two very different type of voters in this country now. I think there are the voters who look at some of the core issues that the Republican Party represents, and for them that is enough. That's what they want to know, is that those values are not going to be in some way abridged. There's a different set of voters, of which I include myself, who have a much broader interest in solving issues. I am not a campaign person, believe it or not. I am an issues person. We spent hours working on issues to solve problems and to put forward problem-solving ideas that were not necessarily Democratic or Republican. Mm-hmm. They were debt, deficit, healthcare, the environment. I don't think we had one serious conversation after the primary about climate change. Climate change is a significant issue. It's going to affect the agricultural community amazingly, but in the counties, I didn't hear a lot of farmers talking about climate change. They were talking about tariffs. Again, an issue which should have favored us, but apparently did not. So moving forward, I think people get involved in campaigns often because they have an issue that they are truly tied to. Teachers do that. The labor community has in the past to an extent. In the environmental community, there are any number that you can, and those people are going to stay involved. And if you can look at the platforms and really look at the candidates and see what they are concerned about, I think, win or lose, if you get to engage in the process, then you're going to find some value in it. We didn't win, and we lost by a much greater margin than I thought we would, but it was a valuable process. So civic engagement, the class of civics, which I think most of us probably took, is not what it used to be. It is a big societal challenge to change that, but I think people, what I would say, and this is preaching a little bit, I realize that, but vote beyond your own self-interest. Mm-hmm. If you can look at a community, statewide, or even globally, and begin to vote in a manner that works for improvements for all people, I think that's important.
I want to look at how Knox County fared in the state of Tennessee, because I think we've seen some pretty dramatic improvements. TNDP had released some statistics saying that Knox County ranked third most changed county in the state of Tennessee. And we have some graphics here that show the percentage change. And so while, I mean, we've just discussed this, that while, it wasn't blue win across the board, that is very telling right there. And I think we even have a map of Tennessee. And, people were talking about blue wave. I mean, to me, that just screams that there is change. And that's something that we definitely need to be proud of.
Absolutely, yes. I think that for those of us who are involved in elections, and for the volunteers who get involved in campaigns, it's a tough pill to swallow when the result of all your work is pass-fail. I mean, there's no B or C or D grade here, but that map that you just showed is an indication that every door knocked and every phone call made is worthwhile, and all the money we poured into it. I think that it's a matter of persistence. What we witnessed, especially with the coordinated campaign, I think the last time I checked, they had knocked upwards of 100,000 doors in Knox County. is something that I'm very proud of.
It's huge. And I don't think anything like that's been
done
before.
Never been a campaign.
I mean, a coordinated campaign in itself, right? I mean, I think that there has been some coordinated, but not on the level that it was this election cycle.
Yeah. Well, and I'll continue the academic analogy. We have taken some strides here. I feel like the party statewide is still in elementary school. We have 2 congressional seats. We have no Senate seats. We do not have the governor's house. We do not have a majority in the Senate. We do not have a majority in the House. We are looking at really a lack of control for changing issues. So we're taking steps. Politically speaking, we're in elementary school. Looking at the value system and other things, I think we're reaching a postgraduate level in what we're trying to achieve, and the 2 are not matching up very well right now. For the party going forward, I was disappointed on August the 3rd, the day after the primary, to realize that the party did not have a plan for a coordinated campaign. Fortunately, and let's be honest about this, Phil Bredesen just said, I'm going to turn my apparatus over. It will become the coordinated campaign, and it did, and it was effective. There's no question about that. I've worked for the party, so I'm not sitting here condemning them. I've worked with the party for almost 30 years now. Their job from day one in every election cycle should be to spend 8 months getting prepared for the coordinated campaign. And then in this case, on August 3rd, it should have been up and running. They don't need to spend time worrying about party organization. And I've been part of this. There is so much concern about party organization. At the end of the day, the only thing that the party is there for is getting candidates elected. They serve a lot of other purposes, but the primary aspect is getting them elected. I don't know who's going to run the party next year, but I would encourage this. At the end of the primary in 2020, the coordinated campaign should be independent, it should be ready to go, and the candidates should know what the buy-in is and what the process is going to be. We had a good model this year, and it worked. The startup in August was problematic. I'll just say that.
So I think that is something we can definitely improve upon, and that was one of the goals of tonight's show, was to talk about areas where we could focus on improving. And like you had mentioned, there is a reorganization that's going to be happening. So I think that's really important feedback, and we need to keep that in mind going forward.
Well, just to say that I know that records were kept of all these volunteers who got involved. I mean, to me, I was flabbergasted by the number of fresh faces that I saw walking through our office in West Knoxville. Ensuring that relationships are built with those people and they continue to be involved. The local party can ensure that precinct captains are appointed, that district meetings are productive, that candidates are recruited for local offices, because frankly, I mean, the Republicans have built a power structure, frankly, by controlling local offices and working their way up. So to the better ability we can control and gain seats in county commission, school board, mayor, county mayor, what have you, the better off we'll be in the future. To that end, I mean, I think the coordinated was a very powerful endeavor, but there are some improvements that have to be made in the future, and we should be wary of spreading ourselves too thin.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you both
Absolutely.
for being on here. It was a very informative discussion, and we really appreciate all that you've put into these campaigns, and we hope you stick around.
Thank you.
And thank you so much, and we will see you next week for DTV.